Welcome to this final lecture in this series on the Great Ejection of 1662, a pivotal point in the spiritual history of our country, when approximately 2,000 gospel ministers were thrown out of their positions in the Church of England after the restoration of King Charles II for failing to conform to the Act of Uniformity. In previous lectures, we considered the historical background to this event and the reasons why so many faithful evangelical ministers felt unable to subscribe to the new Act. We also looked at the experiences of some of the ministers on Black Bartholomew's Day itself, the farewell sermons they preached to their congregations, and what they did in the aftermath of their ejection. Today, we're going to focus on the local scene, concentrating on those ejected ministers known as Bartholomeans from Leicestershire. And I hope that as we learn about events that happen to real people in our county, we will be challenged and inspired in our own Christian walk and witness. First, an outline of today's lecture. 1. The roll call of Leicestershire ejected ministers. 2. A general survey of the Leicestershire situation from 1662 to 1672. 3. 4 stories. This will be a look at the different experiences of 4 ejected ministers. And fourthly, a brief conclusion. First then, the roll call of Leicestershire ejected ministers. It's hard to be precise about the exact number of ministers ejected in Leicestershire, as the documentary evidence is rather unreliable and incomplete. However, a careful analysis of the records by the historian A.G. Matthews came up with a figure of 35 men in Leicestershire who were certainly ejected, but there may have been a few more. In addition, other ejected ministers moved into Leicestershire after 1662 from neighbouring counties, and some were very active in gospel work in the county subsequently. This summer, we've been visiting the various places from which these 35 ministers were ejected. In only a few of the churches is there any record of them. Now, I'm not a native of Leicestershire, so I've learnt a lot about local geography. And I tried to imagine what it must have been like 360 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution. Canals, railways and mining dramatically changed the landscape and people's lives. And I've thought about launching a new long-distance walk as an alternative to the Leicestershire Round. But there would be some drawbacks to this ejection trail, not least that to have an authentic experience, you would need to be thrown out of every place on the route. Well, for some of these 35 faithful ministers, only their name survives, but for others, comments made about them at the time were recorded. And I've been practicing my pronunciation of the place names, but I hope you'll excuse me if I get any wrong. Here then, the Leicestershire roll call, in alphabetical order. 1. Richard Adams, Vicar of Humberston. 2. John Bennett, Vicar of Whitwick, a man of considerable learning, pleasant and quick in conversation, plain and sound in preaching. 3. Mauritius Boheme, Rector of Hallerton. He had written exercises on several scriptures, much recommended by several learned divines. He returned to his native Germany on ejection. 4. Thomas Boss, Rector of Blaby. In 1650, with 2 fellow ministers, he engaged in a dispute with Baptists at Earlshilton. 5. Oliver Bromskill, Rector of Loughborough. His deportment was grave and serious, his temper mild, humble and peaceable. but he was a little reserved. 6. St John Burrow, Rector of Houghton on the Hill. He was the oldest minister to be ejected in Leicestershire, being nearly 80 years of age, and described as a man of great eminence and worth. 7. John Chester, Rector of Witherley. Apparently reckoned the most wicked town in all the county. But by Mr. Chester's industry in preaching, catechising and daily visiting from house to house, several of them were brought to a considerable knowledge in religion and love to the best things. He was of a very sober, calm, peaceable spirit, sound in doctrine and life, and a grave and fruitful preacher. 8. Matthew Clark, Rector of Narborough. He was 3 times imprisoned in Leicester Jail for the crime of preaching. 9. Young Dixie, Vicar of St Margaret's, Leicester. He died the following year in Hinckley, where it was said of him, he lived and died a Non-Conformist. 10. Samuel Doughty, Rector of Simpson. He later preached at his house in Ashby. He was a good preacher and exemplary in his life, of a meek, humble, modest and peaceable temper. 11. Richard Drayton, Rector of Shankton. It was said of him that, in his younger years, he was under grievous temptations, even to despair. But when he, through the grace of God, overcame them, he was the more fitted for the ministry, and the better able to pity and assist such as were tempted. When he left his living, he had nothing left to live upon, but the providence of God and the charity of good people. 12. James Farmer, Rector of Leah. He later moved to Barwell. A very holy, spiritual man, and zealous in his ministry. He preached but sometimes after his ejectment, and lived not many years. 13. George Green, Vicar of Steadingworth. A very holy man. He died in the very week that he was preparing to quit his living upon the Bartholomew Act. 14. Walter Hornby, assistant at Church Langton. He was a very pious, serious man, but ordinarily melancholy, and yet at times very cheerful. 15. Nicholas Kestian, Rector of Gumley. A man of eminent piety. After being silenced, he went to Leicester, where he was pastor of a congregation for several years. John Bunyan, on the first Sunday after his release from prison in 1672, preached at Kestian's house in Leicester. 16. Thomas Langdale, Curat of Great Bowden. After, he preached to large gatherings at Great Bowden and Market Harborough. 17. Thomas Ledbetter, Vicar of Hinckley. His ministerial labours were very acceptable and useful to this town. He was a grave, learned and judicious man. 18. Joseph Lee, Rector of Cottesbatch. Later, he preached for a time in an old barn at Lutterworth. 19. Thomas Lowry, Curat of Market Harborough. He was a Scot, given liberty to remain in England in 1650. 20. Richard Muston, Rector of Lawton. He was all his lifetime a lover of good men, and follower of that which was good. What he lacked in parts, he made up in serious affection. He left his living when he was very aged and unprovided of other supports of life, and retired to Coventry, where he found God and good people kind to him, till age wore him away. 21. Samuel Aldershaw, Vicar of Lawton. After his ejectment, he served as chaplain to a gentry family and also practised medicine. 22. Matthew Patchett, Curat of Thermiston. He had also ministered in Wanlip. 23. John St Nicholas, Rector of Lutterworth. To the last, and he lived to a good old age, he was used to style himself a student in St Paul's epistles. 24. Samuel Shaw, Rector of Long Watton. A mixture of so much learning and humility, wit and judgment, piety and pleasantness are rarely found together as met in him. His praying frequently dissolved the whole company into tears. 25. William Sheffield, Curate of Stoke Golding. And previously he'd been rector of Ibstock. During his ministry there, he was greatly respected and beloved, not only by his own parishioners, but by the generality. 26. William Sims, lecturer at St Martin's, Leicester, where he was buried in 1669. 27. John Smith, rector of Wanlip. He was said to have once been a London hatter. 28. Thomas Smith, vicar of Castle Donington. His preaching and praying was affectionate, and his life was exemplary. He was well beloved by his parish, and much lamented when silenced. His very enemies had nothing to say against him. And ejected with Smith was Mr Cockayne, master of Castle Donington's school. 29. William Smith, vicar of Packington. He was a worthy divine and a plain, profitable preacher. 30. Nathaniel Stevens, rector of Fenudreton. He was a good scholar and a useful preacher. 31. Henry Watts, rector of Swepston. In his later years he preached at Hinckley and had some hundreds of hearers to whom he constantly preached, settling a congregation of sober, serious Christians, among whom he bestowed his labours freely. 32. William Wilson, vicar of Foxton. He later preached at Great Bowden. 33. George Wright, rector of Congerston. A man of great piety and a very useful awakening preacher. He had a more than common gift in prayer and a great felicity in discoursing warmly of spiritual things, by which God made use of him as an instrument of good to many. 34. John Wright, rector of Edmundthorpe. And finally, 35. John Yaxley, rector of Kibworth Beecham. He was a sincere, plain-hearted man, a faithful friend, and very communicative. He was brutally ejected from his parsonage and his wife pushed downstairs by the soldiers. And when she attempted to rescue their baby granddaughter from the cradle, she was shot in the head and permanently blinded. Section 2. A general survey of the Leicestershire situation from 1662 to 1672. And in many ways, events in Leicestershire were typical of what was happening nationally in 1662 and the years that followed, things we heard about in the previous lectures. Among the 35 men ejected locally, there were those of Presbyterian, Congregational and Baptist convictions, their ages ranging from about 30 to nearly 80. In most cases, the older ministers had been ordained by a bishop, but many of the younger ones had received ordination from a local Presbyterian classis, often the one based in Wirksworth in Derbyshire. We find men who continued to attend the parish church after ejection and were on friendly terms with the parish minister. In Leicestershire, there were some zealous justices of the peace bent on persecuting non-conformists. Many ejected ministers were fined, had their goods confiscated, and at least 7 ministers suffered imprisonment in Leicester Jail. As a result of the 1665 5 Mile Act, a large number were forced to move house. There are examples of ministers teaching, serving as private chaplains, practicing medicine, and keeping a farm. And there were cases of real hardship, but we witness also the bonds of supportive fellowship forged between ministers. And we could discover more about nonconformity in the county from a national inquiry about conventicles, or secret meetings of nonconformists, ordered by Archbishop Sheldon in 1669, 7 years after the ejection. The aim was to gain information in order to suppress them. Leicestershire parish clergy were required to provide answers to a series of questions about where these conventicles were being held, their denomination, who their teachers or preachers were, and the rough numbers of people attending, along with their names and occupations. And of course, caution is necessary about this information, much of it being anecdotal and supplied by informers. However, fascinating evidence is recorded of numerous secret conventicles being held, at which ejected ministers, along with laymen, often preached. The Leicestershire return of 1669 reckoned that there were over 2,400 conventicles taking place throughout the county. The Great Ejection may be considered as a tragedy for the Church of England, but in the providence of God it resulted in the truth of the gospel being spread more widely, and many nonconformist churches trace their beginnings to this period. In 1672, Charles II granted a measure of religious freedom to nonconformists. Under the year-long indulgence, nonconformist preachers and meeting places could apply for licences, indicating if they were Presbyterian, Congregational or Baptist. And a good number of Leicestershire ejected ministers were licensed, though the denominational attributions are not always reliable. However, the subject of the development of post-Restoration nonconformity in the county is too big and complex for this lecture. Our focus here is on what happened to the ejected ministers in the decade after 1662. Section 3, 4 stories. And to illustrate some of these issues, we're now going to hear the stories of 4 men in a bit more detail. 2 of them were identified as Presbyterians, as the majority of the ejected ministers were. 1 became a Congregationalist and 1 a Baptist. And all of them made a significant impact for the gospel in Leicestershire and on a wider stage. And I'm going to start with the 2 older men, both in their mid-50s at the time of ejection, and both of Presbyterian views. The first of these is John St Nicholas, ejected rector of Lutterworth. And I've included John St Nicholas for a personal reason. As I began researching the ejected ministers, I was amazed to discover that one of them was buried only 100 yards or so from where I was sitting at my dining room table. And this is where John St Nicholas, supposedly pronounced Seneclas, but we'll stick with St Nicholas, the ejected rector of Lutterworth, was laid to rest in May 1698 in his 95th year. And he was buried in the chancel of the church, indicating the high esteem in which he was held. And I was curious to find out how he ended up in Burbage and how, as an ejected minister, he was accorded such an honour within a parish church. And this research is very much a work in progress, but I'd like to acknowledge the help of the local Burbage Heritage Group in establishing the probable location of John's house in the village. Well, John was born into an ancient gentry family at Ash, near Sandwich in Kent, in 1604. His family had strong Puritan convictions, and John must have been early taught the things of God. Aged 15, in 1619, he matriculated as a student at the Puritan Emmanuel College in Cambridge, at the same time as his elder brother Thomas, 18 months his senior. The two brothers shared chambers and remained close all their lives, having lost their mother when they were very young boys. They were united in their love for the Reformed faith and their parliamentary sympathies. And after Cambridge, their ways parted, Thomas entering the law and John living in Ely for a while. John's godly convictions were manifested in his financial backing of the early Non-Conformist colonists who left England because of increasing Laudian persecution to settle in Massachusetts in 1628 to 29. And although John St Nicholas didn't actually emigrate himself, he continued to take an interest in events there. He later dedicated a book to the governors and ministers of New England, declaring himself to be, quotes, a sympathiser in your joys, fears and sorrows, a spectator and observer of the mutual transactings betwixt God and you. Around this time, John married Ethelreda Good of Stretton-under-Foss in Warwickshire, and he retained strong links with that county. By the early 1650s, John was living with his family, he had 6 children, in Lutterworth, probably acting as lecturer at St Mary's Church, where the rector had been sequestered, as well as officiating in Monk's Kirby, just across the A5 in Warwickshire. He was officially appointed as rector of Lutterworth in March 1659. What an honour it must have been for him to minister in the great John Wycliffe's church in Lutterworth, the place where the English Bible originated. The presumption is that he must have received Presbyterian ordination at some stage. But the 1650s were a sad time too for John. 2 of his children were buried in Lutterworth Church in 1653, and then his wife Ethelreda in 1654. And overshadowed by this personal loss, in 1653, John was nominated on the approval of Oliver Cromwell to the short-lived Barebones Parliament, sometimes called the Parliament of the Saints, representing Warwickshire. His brother Thomas, now a parliamentary army officer, lawyer and poet, was nominated for Yorkshire. And now comes the connection with Burbage. In 1657, aged 53, John St Nicholas had married for the second time, travelling the 9 miles or so up Watling Street, now the A5, from Lutterworth to Burbage. His bride was a 42-year-old spinster, Lady Priscilla Gray, youngest daughter of Anthony Gray, the beloved former rector of St Catherine's, Burbage. Anthony Gray, who died 12 years earlier, was a remarkable man. A staunch Puritan who had ministered in Burbage for 50 years, and he unexpectedly inherited the title of the 9th Earl of Kent when he was aged 83. Many pressed him to quit the ministry, but he, quotes, did not abate the constancy of his preaching so long as he was able to be led up into the pulpit. And the only difference his new title seemed to make was that he was no longer molested by the authorities for his nonconformity, as he had been when he was plain Mr. Anthony Gray. And after her father's death, Priscilla Gray had remained in Burbage to care for her widowed mother, who died in 1653. Well, John and Priscilla did not live long in Lutterworth after their marriage, since John was ejected in 1660 to make way for a very elderly royalist who neglected his new charge and lived in Leicester. And so the couple retired to live in Burbage, where Priscilla had inherited considerable property, including the White House or Manor House, where it is likely that they lived. And although St Nicholas was thus ejected before 1662, his views meant that in conscience he would not have been able to conform to the Act of Uniformity. We know that he was a faithful supporter of the parliamentary cause, though strongly opposed to the regicide, and may well have signed the Solemn League and Covenant. If he had been ordained by a Presbyterian classis, he would have objected to the demand for reordination by a bishop. Very likely he would have taken issue too with some things in the new prayer book. Priscilla died in 1665, but John continued to live in Burbage until his death over 30 years later. In his late 50s, at the time of his enforced retirement, John was a man of status and private means and could comfortably have put his feet up. However, he's a shining example of how to carry on serving God in older years. So what did he do? 1. He set an example to those he lived amongst. Being of a Presbyterian persuasion, he retained a desire to be part of the national church. And thus it is recorded he, quotes, went to the public parish church as long as he was able to go abroad, notwithstanding that he was for many years so thick of hearing that he could not hear a word that was said. When he was asked why he would go to church when he had lost his hearing, he declared he went to give an example to others, being afraid that if he should stay at home on the Lord's Day when there was a sermon in the church, others might be encouraged to stay at home and keep from church too, though they had no such difficulty as he laboured under. The rector of Burbage at this time, John Pitts, was a godly man, and he and St Nicholas evidently shared a mutual respect. And 2 later rectors served in Burbage during John's lifetime. 2. As well as attending the parish church, John continued to preach for as long as he was physically able. A manuscript volume of sermons, dated 1662-3, now preserved in a library in Chicago, is thought to be his work. If so, they're likely to have been preached in Non-Conformist conventicles in or near Burbage. In 1672, John was licensed to preach as a Presbyterian at his house in Burbage, and in 1690, when he was 86, there are reports of him still preaching in the village. In that same year of 1690, mention is also made of St Nicholas preaching in nearby Hinckley, taking the place of his deceased son-in-law Henry Watts, another ejected minister married to his daughter Mercy. 3. John showed generosity to other ejected ministers, using his wealth to help other ejected ministers in need. He had a house at Knowle in Warwickshire, and when he heard that James Wright, ejected from Watton, had nowhere to go when displaced by the 5 Mile Act in 1666, St Nicholas wrote him a letter inviting him to Knowle, telling him there was a chamber, bed and study there which he should be welcome to. James Wright gratefully accepted the invitation, subsequently keeping a school and preaching at the house. Another ejected minister who'd fallen on hard times, John Gilpin, the old Puritan who always preached in his ruff, was also able to live in this house until his death soon after. Apparently the house, known as Blue Lake, was demolished in the 1960s. In addition, St Nicholas left 20 shillings in his will for the support of Richard Southwell, an ejected minister who was preaching at Hinckley. 4. John kept himself intellectually and spiritually active. He continued to study the scriptures and write books. He was, quotes, an able scholar, who to the last was used to style himself a student in St. Paul's epistles. And this reveals his humility and his desire to always be learning from God's word. The books John produced were mostly designed to help ordinary believers in their faith. In 1642, he'd published an English translation of a Puritan classic written in Latin, William Ames's The Marrow of Sacred Divinity. In 1663, John issued A Help to Beginners in the Faith, which contained explanations of the Creed and the Lord's Prayer. This was followed by The History of Baptism in the 1670s, dedicated to the memory of his deceased father-in-law. Finally, in 1695, when John was 90 years old, he wrote The Widow's Mite, an exposition of Luke 24, verse 26. And in John St. Nicholas's final years, deaf and perhaps unable even to take the short walk from his house to the church, he lived, it is said, secluded from the world, his chief amusement being his library. Aged 94, he died and was buried in Burbage Church on the 30th of May, 1698, next to his second wife, Priscilla. The gravestone is no longer visible, but his epitaph has been recorded. It read, Resting in Hope, a reference from Psalm 16, verse 9. My flesh also shall rest in hope, indicating that his hope of eternal life was sure, resting only in Christ. And if you would like to hear more about John St. Nicholas, he will be the subject of my online St. Anselm's lecture on the 6th of December. Our second subject is Nathaniel Stevens. And if you've ever visited Twycross Zoo, you'll have driven along the A444, passing the little village of Fenudreton, the location for our second ejected minister, Nathaniel Stevens. At the time of his ejection in 1662, Stevens was 55 years old and had been faithfully ministering at St Michael and All Angels, Fenudreton, for about 24 years, having settled there before the outbreak of civil war. Stevens was born in Wiltshire in 1607, where his father was a vicar, before going on to Oxford University, where he studied diligently for the ministry, being ordained in 1630. He became rector at Fenudreton in 1638, due to the patronage of the powerful Purefoy family. The motto, Pure Faith, My Joy. The Purefoys were Puritan supporters who had ensured a succession of godly ministers in Fenudreton stretching back to the 1580s at least. And if you visit the church today, you can see family monuments to the Purefoys, but also a plain, unadorned church with Bible texts over the arches. That Nathaniel Stevens was a man of the Purefoys' choice indicates his commitment to the reformed biblical cause. When the Civil War broke out in 1642, Stevens took refuge in Coventry, a parliamentary stronghold, to escape royalist persecution. A group of about 30 godly ministers were sheltering in Coventry at this time, including Richard Baxter, with whom Stevens discussed theology and formed a lasting friendship. While in Coventry, Stevens served as the morning preacher at St Michael's Church, later to become the cathedral, and subscribed to the Solemn League and Covenant, which showed his Presbyterian sympathies. After Stevens resumed his ministry in Fenudreton in 1645, the village's most famous resident, 21-year-old George Fox, founder of the Quakers, enters the story. George Fox had been baptised in Fenudreton Church in 1624, where his father was a Puritan churchwarden. Nathaniel Stevens had known young George since he was a child. Now he was a troubled young man with lots of questions about religion. At first, Stevens thought highly of young George and patiently devoted much time to discussions with him on spiritual topics, including the death of Christ. Stevens himself was a man of a generous Catholic spirit, but one who hated ritual and ceremoniousness, so no doubt would have had some sympathy for Fox's unhappiness with outward religious forms. But Fox resented it when Stevens began to preach on subjects from their talks. Stevens' biographer also suggests that, quotes, his fondness for whimsicality helped alienate him from the humourless Fox. And a little light humour can sometimes serve to take the sting out of an argument, but not, apparently, in this case. Fox was not prepared to listen to Stevens or any minister and went wandering off on his own to find God, going further and further into mysticism. In 1649, while Stevens was giving a sermon in Market Bosworth, Fox interrupted him. Stevens shouted out that he was mad, and Fox, driven out of the town by a mob, began to regard, quotes, priest Stevens as his chief persecutor. In 1654, public debates between the two demonstrated the opposition between Fox's extreme anti-clerical beliefs and Stevens' orthodox biblical faith. "Neighbours," said Stevens, "this is the business. George Fox is come to the light of the sun, and now he thinks to put out my starlight." Stevens had similar debates with Gerard Winstanley of the Levellers and with Baptists. The 1640s and 1650s, the period of the Civil War and the Commonwealth, was a time of great social upheaval, and new religious ideas flourished in an age that allowed religious liberty. Nathaniel Stevens, confronted by such new ideas in the shape of George Fox in his own parish, entered the fray as a defender of the faith, the champion of reasoned biblical orthodoxy. His motive was a real pastoral concern for his flock, explaining, quotes, "I could not but rise and look after such neighbours and friends of mine, who, in my apprehension at least, were as sheep gone astray." Stevens was essentially a moderate and fair man, using careful scriptural arguments and refraining from vitriolic personal attacks on those from whom he differed. But what then did Quakers believe that orthodox Calvinists like Stevens felt they must strongly refute? Like many sects, Quaker teaching was a mixture of truth and error, a dangerous combination. Biblical texts were sometimes taken out of context to support radical ideas that ran counter to overall biblical truth. Fox wanted a more simple, sincere Christianity, rejecting all outward forms and rituals, and this included baptism and the Lord's Supper, any kind of organised educated ministry, or services in what he called steeple houses. Fox saw that it was the heart experience of Christ that was of vital importance, but problems arose with his subjective emphasis on the Holy Spirit speaking to individual believers, the inner light which could be found in each person. When this subjective revelation becomes the primary authority, rather than God's revealed word, the Bible, by which all our ideas and thoughts must be tested, it's all too easy to slip into delusion or error. And because of his personal involvement with controversies of the time, in the 1650s, Stevens wrote several books. In 1651, he published a defence of infant baptism after being challenged on the issue by Baptist followers in Earl Shilton. In 1656, a major work on scriptural prophecies in Revelation, a hot topic of the time. And in a book published in 1658, in Defence of Original Sin, he systematically argued this doctrine from the scriptures at a time when it was being denied by some radical groups. So, what happened to Stevens after his ejection? Stevens had been ordained by a bishop before the Civil Wars, so he wouldn't have had a problem with reordination in 1662. But his signing of the Solemn League and Covenant and his abhorrence of ritualistic ceremony would have made it impossible for him to conform and mark him out as a Presbyterian. He made way for his successor at Fenudreton in January 1663, but continued to live in the village for some time, preaching privately to small groups. But his services were often interrupted. He was forced to move house 7 times because of persecution, very disruptive for his wife and family. However, he was finally able to settle in Stoke Golding, a village just a few miles away, which seemed to have served as a haven for a group of fellow Non-Conformist ministers, of whom we'll hear more shortly. Nathaniel took every opportunity to continue preaching until lameness prevented him. In 1669 he was recorded as preaching at Hinckley, 4 miles from Stoke, and in 1672 he was registered as a Presbyterian at his home in Stoke Golding. And from Stevens' pioneering work, the Hinckley Presbyterian Great Meeting developed. Richard Southwell, Henry Watts, and his father-in-law John St Nicholas also preached to this congregation in its early years. And it's the place where Philip Doddridge later preached his first sermon. And how sad that this church, founded on a love for biblical doctrine, would lapse into Unitarianism in the 18th century. In Stevens' latter years, he's remembered as being pleasant and cheerful. A friend recounted paying a visit to Stevens' home in Stoke Golding one day, when only Nathaniel and his wife Joan were at home. No one came to open the door in response to his knock, but Nathaniel's voice called them to come in, asking, quotes, whether of the two they would have had open the door for them, the blind or the lame, his wife being blind and he so lame as not to be able to rise out of his chair without help. Stevens died aged 71 and was buried in the churchyard at Stoke Golding in February 1678, leaving behind Joan, 4 sons and 2 daughters. George Fox may have dubbed Nathaniel a trampler on the truth, but rather he was an example of, quote, true starlight, reflecting the light of Christ, the morning star. Now our third story is of a man who took a different path after his ejection, Richard Adams, ejected vicar of Humberston. Very little is known about Richard Adams' early life, and there are many unanswered questions about his biography in general. As far as I know, Adams published no books. However, he was a much younger man than John St Nicholas and Nathaniel Stevens, who, in the late 1650s, became vicar of Humberston near Leicester, in the 17th century a farming community. Richard Adams had trained for the ministry under John Tombs at Bewdley in Worcestershire prior to 1650. Tombs, a Puritan minister, became famous, or notorious, for his vigorous opposition to infant baptism, on which subject he took part in at least 9 bitter public debates, the most famous being against Richard Baxter in 1650. And whether this association with Tombs influenced Adams' own views on baptism, we can only conjecture. But subsequently, Adams went on to become a Baptist and a prominent figure in post-Restoration Baptist history. Baptist beliefs had flourished in the parliamentary armies during the 1640s and the religious liberty allowed in the Commonwealth period of the 1650s. Leicestershire itself witnessed the establishment of many Baptist congregations during these decades, both particular or Calvinistic Baptists and more numerously General or Arminian Baptists. However, Adams' own position during these years is a bit of a mystery. While many Baptists had already quit the national church on principle prior to the Restoration, he remained a Church of England vicar until he was ejected from Humberston Parish Church in 1661, when another vicar was installed. It is possible that he'd not yet made up his mind on the issue of baptism. On ejection, Adams moved the 8 or 9 miles up the road to Mount Sorrel, where the quarry is now located. Mount Sorrel is understood to be where his wife came from. And there he began to keep a school and preach in his own house, which he did for many years. He frequently shared in days of prayer with 3 other local ministers, 2 of whom had also been ejected, Matthew Clark and John Shuttlewood, and more on them shortly, and the particular Baptist Richard Farmer of Kilby and Armsby. And the 4 men met at Lowsby Hall, home of Mr. Richard Wollaston, where they took turns in preaching to a group gathered there. And despite their differing persuasions on infant baptism and ecclesiology, they were united in their love for God's word and a desire to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. In Mount Sorrel, Adams faced persecution in the shape of Matthew Babington, an MP and local justice of the peace, who was renowned to be the most zealous oppressor of non-conformists in Leicestershire. Babington fined Adams a shilling a day for preaching and ordered the officers to seize the pewter items in Adams' house. However, in a show of support for Adams, local pewterers refused to buy the impounded goods when they were offered to them. And Babington told Adams he was not against him keeping a school if he would refrain from preaching. And when Babington dropped dead from a sudden hemorrhage in 1669, the Nonconformists saw the hand of God in this judgment. And although there had been general Baptists in Mount Sorrel since at least the early 1650s, Adams, a moderate Calvinist, does not appear to have been formally connected to them. And although the 1669 return suggests he was linked with the Baptists, one Baptist historian says that this was a mistake, and in fact he was attached to the Independents. This was borne out by the Indulgence of 1672, when Adams was licensed as Congregational or Independent at his house in Mount Sorrel. So if he did have Baptist convictions at this stage, this historian concludes they seem to have been a private matter. However, by 1689, there is definite proof that Richard Adams had become a Baptist. In that year, after about 25 years in Mount Sorrel, Adams moved to London, when he was chosen as an elder of the General Baptist Church at Shad Thames, Bermondsey. And this indicates something of the fluidity that still existed at the time, when evangelicals of differing theological positions could in some places still worship together. Indeed, Adams served as a representative at the particular Baptist Assembly in that same year, when the famous 1689 Baptist Confession of Faith was approved. In fact, Adams was one of the 7 London ministers, along with William Kiffin, Hansard Knowles and Benjamin Keach, who signed the letter in June 1689 inviting churches to come to the assembly. But Adams failed to persuade the church at Shad Thames to join the particular Baptists, and so in 1690 he left them to become co-pastor with William Kiffin of the particular Baptist church in Devonshire Square, London, and sole pastor on Kiffin's death in 1701. Sadly, differences soon divided this church, and Adams was embroiled in troubles. When an assistant was ordained in 1706, Adams felt that he could honourably look around for a change of pastorate. Correspondence ensued with various Baptist churches, including Portsmouth and Whitchurch in Shropshire. But in 1709, Adam's wife died, so his situation was now quite different. Writing to the Baptists at Whitchurch, Adams explained, "It has pleased the great disposer of all things to remove my dear and loving wife from me by death, which has made a great alteration in the scene of my affairs. She was a good companion, both in a temporal and spiritual account. I would have gone with her into any part of England where I might have had a prospect of serving Christ and his interest. She had a great desire to live in the country, where she might enjoy the benefit of a good air. But now she is gone, where there will be no complaint for the want of these outward comforts." Besides, Adam went on, some of the chief brethren from his London congregation had made it clear that they didn't want him to leave the church there. So Adams remained in London. In 1712, he was pensioned off from the pastorate at Devonshire Square on £12 a year, and he died in 1716. And now our fourth and final biography is that of Matthew Clark, ejected from Narborough. Clark, only in his early 30s when he was ejected, deserves the title Apostle of Leicestershire for his extraordinary evangelistic endeavours after his ejection. Matthew Clark was born around 1630 in Shropshire, the son of a rector, and was about 12 when the Civil War broke out. After graduating from Cambridge University, Matthew spent some time as chaplain to Colonel Francis Hacker's cavalry regiment in Scotland from 1651, something his enemies brought up against him later. The zealous Colonel Hacker had seen active service for Parliament in Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, and had become notorious as the person who signed the order to the executioner of Charles I, and was himself present on the scaffold in January 1649. And at the Restoration, Hacker was hung as a regicide. By 1655, Clark was a curate at Ashley, just over the border in Northamptonshire, but in 1658 he became rector of Narborough. Clark was admitted to this living by the Triers, a body set us up under Cromwell to test the suitability of candidates for the ministry. At the Restoration, the sequestered minister attempted to replace Clark, but when the 1662 Act of Uniformity came into force, the patron of Narborough was keen to retain Clark and tried to persuade his able young rector to conform. But, quotes, he could not by any means bring his conscience to a compliance with what the law required. After his ejection, Clark continued to preach in the neighbourhood of Narborough in private houses as long as he had opportunity. Many of his congregation had left the parish church with him. But Clark was a marked man with the authorities, and as the persecution began to hot up, by early 1664 he'd been forced to move with his family to what is described as a very lonesome house in Leicester Forest, where his son, also called Matthew, was born. And with the enforcement of the 5 Mile Act in 1666, Clark sought refuge in Stoke Golding, a small village on the Warwickshire border, where, as we have heard, other ejected ministers also sheltered, namely the older man Nathaniel Stevens and John Shuttlewood, formerly of Ravenston, and Richard Southwell of Wilnicott near Tamworth. Other ministers too would drop by to preach there. Mr. Wilson from Atherstone, William Brooks from Philongley, both of those places in Warwickshire, and Thomas Ledbetter from Hinckley. How wonderful to have this fellowship after the isolation of Leicester Forest. Stoke Golding claims to be the birthplace of the Tudor dynasty, being the place where Henry Tudor is said to have been crowned King of England after his victory over Richard III at the nearby Battle of Bosworth in 1485. But in the 1660s, Stoke Golding could also be dubbed the cradle of Leicestershire nonconformity because of the tireless evangelistic efforts of this band of men based in the village, who travelled around preaching in turn at scores of scattered conventicles in homes, barns and woods across the county. And fittingly, we finished our Leicestershire ejection trail at Stoke Golding on Bartholomews Day, Wednesday the 24th of August 2022, the 360th anniversary of the Great Ejection. Well, Matthew Clark was possessed of enormous zeal and energy, as well as a good horse, and he was at the forefront of this itinerant preaching, quotes, readily embracing all opportunities of service that offered. In 1669, he was reported to be preaching regularly at meetings held in secret in 14 different locations, more than any other individual, and a great sweep around the south and west of the county. Hugglescott, Ibstock, Shackeston, Simpson, Stoke Golding, Barwell, Earl Shilton, Sapcott, Enderby, Ashby Magna, Steadingworth, Kibworth, Market Harborough and Great Bowden. In Stoke Golding itself, meetings were held at Clark's house and that of a lady called Abigail Jones. In some of the places, Clark had only 40 or 50 regular hearers, but in others, like Kibworth, Great Bowden, Market Harborough and Stoke Golding, great numbers, over 200 was not unusual, flocked to the preaching. Sometimes these groups were labelled as Presbyterians or Independents, Congregational, but frequently they were mixed, unaffiliated gatherings of people hungry to come under the sound of the gospel. Individual dissenting churches began to be founded in the 1660s, attributing their foundation to Clark's influence, including 2 places where no conventicles were actually reported in 1669. Narborough Congregational Church and what is now Wigston United Reformed Church. Eventually, the justices managed to arrest Clark and he spent 3 terms in Leicester Jail for the crime of preaching. The jail was then located in the centre of Leicester, and if you've been shopping there, you may have noticed in High Cross Street a plaque marking its former site. It was a damp, dirty and overcrowded dungeon, with meagre supplies of water and food, where infectious diseases were rampant. On one of these spells in prison in February 1669, Clark had the company of 2 of his Stoke Golding brethren, Richard Southwell and John Shuttlewood. And as with the martyrs in Queen Mary's reign, over 100 years earlier, this prison fellowship brought much mutual blessing and encouragement. John Shuttlewood wrote to his wife Elizabeth from Leicester Jail on the 20th of February 1669. He wrote, "I am loath to leave the society of my dear brethren, Mr. Clark and Mr. Southwell, but I hope in the end God will dispose of us, that we shall have cause to say it is best for us to be where God shall carry us. I know not which way to look, but our God is a very present help in a time of trouble, and will let us see that it is not our forecast, but his providence which shall provide an habitation for us. Let us rather beg an improvement than a removal of his dispensation." In 1672, Clark was living at Market Harborough and was registered there as a Presbyterian, although in fact he was a Congregationalist, as well as at Horninghold, a little village 7 miles away. Clark's house at Little Bowden was also licensed as a meeting place. And around this time, he was invited by the large group of believers to whom he'd been preaching to settle as founding minister of the Congregational Church in Market Harborough, which is still in existence today. In the persecuting times of the 1680s, Clarke faced further prosecution in the shape of heavy fines and the seizure of his goods. But despite it all, he continued to serve the Lord and his congregation faithfully for as long as he was able. For many years, in all weathers, Clarke would rise early every Sunday and make the 3-mile ride to his old parish of Ashley to preach, returning after a short dinner to Harborough in the afternoon to preach to his large auditory. In the 1690s, this was estimated to be in the region of 500 to 600 people. Finally, disabled by a stroke, Clarke moved to live near his daughter in Norwich, where he died about 1708, nearly 80 years of age. His son Matthew also became a congregational minister, pastor to a large congregation in Miles Lane, Cannon Street, London. Matthew Clarke's gracious and winsome character was described by those who knew and loved him. And I quote, "His judgment was congregational, but nothing of party could alienate his affection from true piety in whomsoever he beheld it. Nor was it his custom to speak evil of any man, where there was not a notorious cause. He was very remarkable for modesty and humility. He always discovered very low thoughts of himself and his own performances, which made him very backward to censure the weaknesses of others. He was very patient in bearing and forgiving censures passed upon himself. His carriage was so inoffensive and his charity so large that he was generally beloved by those whose minds were not rankled with an inveterate malice against true goodness. Hence he had the good word and respect of many with whose opinions he could not agree. He was naturally generous and used to be very liberal to strangers who solicited charity. His preaching was very plain and suited to the capabilities of the people among whom he laboured. He was an instrument of good to many souls, and the country round about have reason to bless God for him as a promoter of true piety. He had offers made to him that were more advantageous for this world, but nothing could draw him from his people as long as he was capable of serving them." So fourthly and finally, by way of conclusion. There are many lessons that we can learn from the lives of these faithful men, but there's one thing that has struck me particularly about all of them: their desire to continue serving God in their changed circumstances after ejection. Denied the liberty to exercise their ministry lawfully within the Church of England, they did not give up, but were determined to make the best use of every day granted to them. And as was said of a Shropshire Bartholomean, when he could not do what he would, he did what he could. They spoke of their ejection from the Church of England with great sorrow as their civil death. But when they awoke on the 25th of August 1662, the day after, they were still alive in this world. There was no discharge in this war as far as they were concerned. And Richard Baxter spoke of preaching as a dying man to dying men. And perhaps you could say that these ejected men felt constrained to witness as living men to living men while they still had time. And as we close, an incident in the life of John St. Nicholas that happened not long after the ejection serves to illustrate this lesson. In May 1663, John's brother Thomas and his wife had been travelling by coach from Kent to Burbage to pay him a visit, when, about 20 miles from their destination, the coach was overturned by a flash flood at Weedon, Northamptonshire, on the A5. All would have perished but for a thorn bush preventing the coach sinking into the waters. Thomas had told John of this miraculous delivery in a poem expressing gratitude for God's providential intervention. John, a less accomplished poet than his brother, chose to reply in the same fashion, to convey the joyful gratitude of, quotes, your friends in Leicestershire for the divine mercy of God in sparing Thomas's life. John believed that it was vital to learn the lessons that God was trying to teach them through this deliverance, notably that the reason that they had been given more time on earth was in order to do some more good for God. John wrote, Lord, let thy warnings remind us what is past, to keep us humble. Let the pleasant taste of mercies in deliverance engage to serve thine honour with renewed courage, that as thou givest us newly life to see, so may we give a life that's new to thee. Our soul from death now saved, our eyes from tears, our feet from falling into dangerous fears, to know thy righteous paths let our souls muse, our eyes discern them, and our feet let use to walk this life as in thy presence, who hast made this life a land some good to do. And the details of next year's series are now available, and I hope that this brief introduction to the lives of some of Leicestershire's ejected ministers will have whetted your interest to learn more about another of their number, Samuel Shaw, who was ejected from Long Watton. His life had such an impact that I felt he deserved a session all to himself. Please do come along or listen in on Monday the 27th of February to hear more about Samuel Shaw, another Leicestershire hero of the faith.